All right, let's go over as many as we can get in the next 10 minutes. And I think maybe we can get through a couple of these. Starting with measles. If you notice over to the left, I have got received vaccination as a child. Please write down MMR. That stands for measles, mumps, rubella. Also, just to mention, you've got some blanks, and those are just to put in some notes if you want to. So if you see them over to the left or to the right, you can write in those spaces, obviously. All right, measles. The next three actually sort of go along together, but measles is airborne. Now, measles, beside that, you should write the red measles because this is of the measles. This is a very serious type of measles. This is also one that you have been vaccinated for because everybody received an MMR. I think it was a series of 3 vaccines starting at about the 3 months of age, but you wouldn't be at St. Benedict today if you hadn't had an MMR because measles is extremely contagious. And it's also one of those that have come back. I think there was an outbreak at Disneyland in California because it is airborne. So let's talk about it. All right, with the red measles, one of its symptoms is an all-over rash. Now, it's not spots like the chicken pox, but it just looks like you've got a solid red rash. So that's a little bit different. It also tends to attack the retina of your eye. For whatever reason, this particular virus really starts replicating itself when any sort of light hits your retina. So people that have it have to be in the dark all the time, or it can actually cause them to go blind. My older brother had this when I was young, and of course we couldn't go anywhere in the room, but I do remember my parents blocking the windows out with tin foil so no light could come in. And my father, and y'all probably know he's a doctor, he would always have a mask on and he would go into his room to check him, but he couldn't have any light. So we didn't have cell phones, but if you had a cell phone, you couldn't be on it. Just the light from the screen could cause the measles to start replicating. Also, we did have TV. We only had 3 channels, but you couldn't watch TV because the light from the TV, the same thing. We had to make sure that the light from the hallway going into his room was completely dark. So I would sit outside of his room with the door shut and I would read to him or talk to him to give him some sort of company because he's in there. I think he was in there for a total of 30 days and there was nothing he could do. So his days and nights were totally mixed up. He did not know if, because there was no light coming from outside, whether it was morning or night. And I was small, but I do remember this as being a huge problem, and everybody in the house had to comply. He is fine, or he was fine. He didn't have any residual effects from the measles, but it was one of those things that there are cases of people who are blind or partially blind simply because the light and UV light certainly triggers this virus to start replicating. Now, another quick thing that I didn't tell you in the other video, but viruses are very specific for what they attack. When we talk about hepatitis, it is very, very specific for the liver. Anytime you see anything HEPA, it means liver. It's not going to attack your spleen. It's not going to attack upper respiratory. It only wants to attack that particular organ for which it's specific. So the protein coat, and we've talked about those, the receptors, the protein receptors on the virus has to match the protein receptors on the cell that it's trying to infect. And some of these, if they don't match, then they can just mutate their coat until they do. And HIV happens to be the most rapidly of the mutating viruses that I know of currently, that if it can't get in, it can't harm you. However, a lot of times they just mutate until they can get in. All right, let's go to rubella. Rubella is actually called the German measles, and it is also airborne. Now, with rubella, the glands in your throat, the sore throat glands, you're probably familiar with those. Those get quite large. You have a low-grade fever, but not a fever like the red measles. You also have an all-over rash. So at first they may think it's red measles, but it's not as extensive. With the red measles, you tend to look red all over. And with rubella, even though it's a rash, it's more of a patchy rash. It's not a solid rash like with the red measles. So a lot of people with rubella, sometimes they called it the walking measles because people didn't know they had it. They didn't feel too bad. Their temperature wasn't that high, and they had a rash, but they actually thought that was due to something that they came in contact with, and they didn't associate it with the German measles. So this one is the lesser problematic of the two, and actually people were quite functional. The light did not cause this to replicate, so they didn't have to stay in the dark, and it ran its course in a short period of time. All right, the mumps. The mumps is very special because it also is airborne, and this attacks the salivary glands and it attacks the prostate gland in men. So the salivary glands are in your cheeks, and people who had mumps get really swollen cheeks, like they've been storing their nuts for the winter or something. There's no mistaking it. They look very round-faced. Their cheeks are very puffed out, and not the glands in their neck. They do have a fever, but it's not a really high fever. In men, because men have prostate glands, women, you do not have this, the mumps virus attacks the prostate gland and can cause men to become sterile. So again, when I was little, this was a big deal. None of my family members ever got it, but I do know children who had it, and if they were little boys, it was a huge concern to the parents that they may end up becoming sterile as adults because this virus, for whatever reason, tends to attack the prostate gland. Okay, so you've been vaccinated for that. That was the MMR. And another thing about vaccines, that if you have to have a booster, sometimes you have to go back in a month or back in 2 months and have a booster. If that happens, make sure that you get your booster, because if you don't, what that means is that the vaccination was too strong to give you all in one dose, and so you have to come back and get that little doses and then take another little dose and then another little dose. For people who may miss that second dose, or they may go too long before they get that second dose, then they have to go back and start at square one, and they have to start with that first dose all over again. So if any of your vaccinations in the future you take, somebody tells you to come back and get your booster shot, make sure that you do that, because if you don't, you may have to start all over again and get the first shot because you didn't get that booster. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and we will pick up in the next video with influenza.